My name is Petra Nichols, and I am 36 years old. And right now, at this exact moment, I am sitting across from my parents at their dining room table, watching my mother's hands shake as she holds a letter from the bank that says their mortgage has been sold to a private lender, and my father is reading the same letter for the third time. Like the words are going to rearrange themselves into something that makes sense. And he looks up at me and says, "Petra, do you know anything about this?" And I lean back in my chair and I say, "Yes, Dad. I know everything about it because I'm the private lender. I bought your mortgage 4 months ago, and you're currently 3 payments behind, which means I can start foreclosure proceedings whenever I want." And my mother makes a sound like all the air just left her body. And my father says, "What are you talking about?" And I say exactly what it sounds like. "I own your house now, and the only reason you still live here is because I haven't decided yet whether to let you stay." And my mother's voice cracks when she says, "Why would you do this?" And I look at her directly, and I say, "Because yesterday was my 36th birthday, and not one of you called me, texted me, or acknowledged it in any way, just like you've done for the last 15 years, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter. So I decided to buy the one thing you actually care about, and now we're going to have a conversation about value. To understand how I got here to this table with this power and this anger, you need to go back, and I don't mean back a few months. I mean back to when I was 12 years old, standing in the kitchen of this same house holding a homemade birthday cake I had baked myself, because my mother forgot it was my birthday. And my older sister Jenna walked in and said, "Oh, it's your birthday." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Cool," and she took a slice of my cake and left. And that was it. No card, no song. No acknowledgement from my parents who were in the living room watching television. And when I walked in and said it's my birthday, my father looked up and said, "Oh, right. Happy birthday, Pete," and went back to his show. And my mother said, "We'll do something this weekend," and we never did, and that was the first year, but it wasn't the last. I need you to understand this wasn't a one-time oversight. This was a pattern that repeated every single year with the kind of precision that actually takes effort to maintain. Because forgetting once is a mistake, forgetting 15 times is a choice, and my family made that choice over and over while throwing elaborate parties for my sister's birthday and my brother's birthday, complete with decorations and cake and gifts and planned dinners. And the one year I asked my mother why they didn't do that for me, she said, "Petra, you're not really a birthday person." And I was 19 years old, and I said, "I've never said that." And she said, "Well, you never make a big deal about it." And I said, "Because no one else does." And she looked at me like I was being difficult and said, "If you wanted something, you should have asked." And I walked out of the room, and I stopped asking for anything after that. My sister Jenna is 4 years older than me, and she was the kind of daughter my parents showed off. She was outgoing and social, and she knew how to make my parents feel like good parents by succeeding in visible ways. She was homecoming queen. She got into a good college. She married young to a man my parents loved, and every milestone she hit was celebrated like a national holiday. And my brother Colin is 2 years younger than me, and he was babied in the way youngest children often are. And my parents threw him a surprise party when he turned 18, and a graduation party when he finished college, and both times I showed up with a gift and stayed for an hour and left early, because no one noticed when I arrived and no one noticed when I left. I was the middle child, and I don't say that for sympathy, I say it because it's a specific kind of invisible where you're in every family photo, but no one's looking at you. And I learned very early that my presence was assumed and my absence was irrelevant, and birthdays became the annual reminder of exactly where I stood, which was nowhere. When I turned 21, I was in college 3 hours away, and I waited all day for a call that didn't come. And at 9 p.m., I called home, and my mother answered, and I said, "Hi, Mom," and she said, "Oh, Petra, hi, how are you?" And I said, "It's my birthday." And there was a pause, and she said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. We've been so busy. Colin had a soccer tournament," and I said, "It's fine, Mom," and she said, "We'll send you a card," and they didn't. And I sat in my dorm room that night, and I made a decision. I decided I was going to build a life so full and so successful that one day I would have the power to make them feel as small as they made me feel. And I know that sounds petty, and maybe it is, but it was also the most clarifying moment of my life because I stopped waiting for them to see me, and I started building something they couldn't ignore. I studied finance because I was good with numbers, and I liked the clean logic of money, and I graduated with honors and got a job at an investment firm in the city, making $49,000 a year, and I worked my way up steadily and quietly. And every birthday that passed without a call from my family, I added it to a mental ledger that I kept with the same precision they kept their indifference. And by the time I was 30, I was making $96,000 a year, and I had started investing in real estate, small rental properties that generated passive income. And I was building wealth in a way my family had no idea about because they never asked what I was doing with my life. They just assumed I was getting by. My sister called me once when I was 32, and she said, "Petra, can you believe Mom and Dad are still paying off their mortgage?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said they refinanced a few years ago to help Colin with his business, and now they're stuck with payments they can barely afford. And I said, "Why did they refinance?" And she said, "Because Colin needed capital, and they wanted to help." And I said, "Did they ask you for money?" And she said, "No, they know I don't have it." And I said, "Did they ask me?" And she said, "Petra, you know they'd never ask you for money." And I said, "Why?" And she didn't have an answer, and I hung up and I looked up their mortgage records online because property records are public, and I saw that they owed $218,000 on a house they'd owned for 30 years, and they were 3 months behind on payments. I didn't do anything right away. I just watched and I kept track, and over the next 2 years I watched them fall further behind, and I watched the bank send them notices, and I watched my father try to negotiate extensions, and I knew they were drowning. And not once did they call me, not to ask for help, not to tell me what was happening, not even to acknowledge that I existed outside of obligatory holiday dinners, where I showed up with wine and left before dessert and on my 35th birthday. I got a text from my mother at 11:58 p.m. that said, "Happy birthday. Sorry for the late text, been a crazy day," and I didn't respond because I was done performing gratitude for scraps. 6 months later, their mortgage went into default, and the bank started foreclosure proceedings, and the property was going to go to auction, and I called a real estate attorney I had worked with on other investments, and I said I want to buy a mortgage before it goes to auction. How do I do that? And he said you make an offer to the bank, and if they accept, you assume the debt and the terms. And I said set it up, and 3 weeks later, I bought my parents' mortgage for $211,000, which was less than they owed because the bank wanted it off their books, and I became the lien holder on the house I grew up in, and my parents had no idea because the bank sent them a standard notice saying their loan had been sold, and they probably didn't even read it carefully. I didn't tell anyone, I just waited, and I kept track of their payments, and they missed 1, and then 2, and then 3, and I sent them a formal notice through my attorney that said they were in default, and they needed to contact the lender to discuss terms. And my father called the number on the letter, and he got my attorney's office, and they scheduled a meeting, and my attorney said the lender wants to meet in person, and my father said fine, and they set the meeting for yesterday, which was my 36th birthday, and I told my attorney to tell them to meet at their own house at 6 p.m. And he said, "Are you sure about this, Petra?" And I said, "Completely sure." I showed up at 5:55, and my parents looked confused when they opened the door, and my mother said, "Petra, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm here for the meeting." And my father said, "What meeting?" And I said, "The one with your lender." And I walked past them into the dining room, and I sat down and I put the file folder on the table, and my mother said, "I don't understand." And I said, "Sit down." And they sat, and I slid the letter across the table. And I watched them read it, and I watched my father's face go pale, and my mother started shaking. And that's where we are right now in this moment, with me holding all the power, and them finally paying attention. My father says, "Petra, you can't do this." And I say, "I already did." And my mother says, "Please don't do this. We'll figure out the payments." And I say, "You've been saying that for 2 years." And she says, "We'll sell something. We'll get the money." And I say, "From who?" And she doesn't answer, and I say, "Let me guess. You'll ask Jenna or Colin," and my father says, "They're family," and I say, "So am I." And he goes quiet, and I say, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep living here, and you're going to pay me rent at the current market rate, which is $2,000 a month, and if you're late, even once I'm selling this house, and you can figure out where to go next." And my mother starts crying, real tears now, and she says, "Petra, why are you being so cruel?" And I say, "Because yesterday was my birthday, and none of you called, and my father says we forgot." And I say, "You've forgotten for 15 years. And he says, "We didn't mean to." And I say, "Yes, you did. You meant to every single time. Because remembering me was never a priority, and now you're going to remember me every single month when you write me a check." My mother says this isn't fair, and I say, "You're right, it's not fair. I spent my entire childhood and my entire adulthood being erased by the 3 of you and the 1 day a year that was supposed to be mine. You couldn't even send a text until 11:58 at night, and you want to talk to me about fair." And she says, "We love you," and I say, "No, you don't. You love the idea of having 3 children because it looks good in family photos, but you've never once treated me like I mattered, and my father says, Petra, that's not true, and I pull out my phone and I say, Dad, when's my birthday? And he opens his mouth and nothing comes out, and I say, it was yesterday, and he says, I know, and I say, what day was it? And he says, Thursday, and I say, what's the date? And he looks at my mother and I say, you don't know, do you? And my mother whispers, I'm sorry, and I say, sorry, doesn't pay mortgages. I stand up and I leave the folder on the table and I say, the first rent payment is due in 2 weeks. You can mail it to the address on the letter, and my father says, Petra, please. And I stop at the door and I turn around and I say, you had 36 years to make me feel like I was part of this family, and you chose not to. So now you get to pay me $2,000 a month to remember I exist, and I walk out and I get in my car and I sit in the driveway for a minute and I don't feel victorious. I feel empty, but it's a clean kind of empty, like I finally set down something I'd been carrying for too long. My sister called me 2 days later and she said, Petra, what did you do? Mom is hysterical, and I said I bought their house, Jenna. And she said, you what? And I said I bought the mortgage. And now they pay me rent. And she said, that's insane. And I said, what's insane is that none of you called me on my birthday. And she said, Petra, we forgot. And I said, I know you always do. And she said, you're punishing them over a birthday. And I said, no, I'm charging them rent on a property I own. The punishment is just a bonus. And she said, you're being vindictive. And I said, maybe, but I'm also being a landlord. And if they don't like the terms, they can move. And she hung up. My brother didn't call, which is typical, but my mother sent me a long email about how hurt she was and how I was tearing the family apart, and I read it once and I deleted it because I've spent my whole life absorbing their hurt and carrying their comfort, and I'm done. They made the first rent payment on time, and the second one was 4 days late, and I sent a formal notice, and the third one was on time, and I don't go to family dinners anymore, and I don't send gifts, and I don't show up for holidays, and my mother asked me once if I'm ever going to forgive them, and I said, I don't know, Mom. Are you ever going to remember my birthday without me reminding you? And she didn't answer. If you have ever been the person your family forgot, the one whose milestones didn't matter, the one who showed up for everyone else, and no one showed up for you, I need you to know this. You don't owe them access to your success, and you don't owe them forgiveness just because they're sorry they got caught, and if the only way they learn to see you is by paying you, then let them pay. Because some people only value what costs them something, and your presence should have been priceless, but since they treated it like it was worthless, you're allowed to set a price and make them meet it.